Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Joining us today for a teal habitat and hunting update is Kevin Cry, the waterfowl program leader for Texas Park and Wildlife Department. Kevin, welcome back to the show.
I'm glad to be back. Appreciate getting the opportunity to visit with you guys and all the constituents out there.
Yeah, that's right. And the thing is, our listeners are just avid consumers of any update on hunting and habitat. Bird numbers, fluctuations, anything that you can provide in Texas being such a popular state for teal hunting especially. I wanted to get you on here, kind of have you talk this through. We did the report last week, but I know that there's obviously been some changes, especially with the weather along the coast. So, how has the teal season started out, on the coast especially, and then also throughout the state?
Yeah, absolutely. So in classic form, people start asking us weeks, if not months in advance about conditions and habitat and, forecasts about teal season. And in classic form, September rolls around and that curveball gets thrown at us. It seems like every year. And so I always warn everybody when we talk about teal season, that curveball could be thrown at us. And it was once again. The good news is we had a real quiet, if you will, weather-wise opener. It was pretty warm. But no storms really impacted our opening weekend, and it went off as planned. And for the most part, in the heart of the teal hunting portions of the state of Texas, it was very, very good. The areas of the rice prairies of the mid coast, even into the Chenier Plain, where we have landowners, clubs, leases that literally farm for blue-winged teal. Providing water, habitat on an annual basis. They take it very, very seriously, and it's a very, very important activity for Texas hunters. And those individuals had a really, really good couple of days of teal hunting and did all the way up until this storm. If you move into the marsh system, those marshes are kind of hit and miss sometimes. And a lot of times it's highly improved or success improves as hunting begins north of that marsh system in those rice fields and in that prairie habitat and those moist soil units that dot that landscape. And so it literally moves birds out of that environment into the marsh. And so once that hunting starts, birds start moving around and people start doing better for sure along that marsh system. And it sure sounded like the guys in the prairie, average near limits on our public lands. Along the Gulf Coast. It was kind of a mixed bag as usual, but on average about 3 birds per person. These are dotted WMAs, wildlife management areas along the Gulf Coast. Some see significant visitation. We've even had some issues where we're getting so many people showing up where we're having to turn away a bunch of hunters because of the interest that exists. And so it's kind of interesting. I sure wish we had a whole lot more lands to provide.
Yeah, you mentioned that the habitat down there was really, really good. And why was the habitat so good going into the teal season?
Well, it's largely because of a cooler and wetter than average summer, for sure. We had a really abnormal summer for that matter. So people were able to grow good foods, pumping of water, holding water, was kind of not as prevalent as in drier years. And then, with the inflows of fresh water coming down our rivers, flowing into our estuaries and our marshes, that increased the fresh water, decreased the salinities, if you will, in some of those marshes that can grow some of the better foods important to teals. And that was really statewide. Even our high plains playas saw significant increases in water, surface water from the previous year. And those playas are super, super productive. And teal love those type of habitats. And so there was we went from essentially not having a teal season in the Texas Panhandle to, having, one of our average type years where there's fairly abundant water on the landscape and people had places to go. And those hunts were pretty successful as well. So, yeah, the habitat was good. East Texas is an interesting, fruit to peel. And it's, we have lots of large reservoirs in that landscape. The upper ends of those reservoirs sometimes hold decent numbers of blue wings. We have a handful of landowners and wildlife management areas that are actively managing moist soil type units. Those environments typically are real good. The reservoirs are real hit and miss. I mean, sometimes there's a bunch of birds there, and obviously we're hunting a migration. So, they're today, gone tomorrow type scenario. And then, there's the issue of a lot of times some of those reservoirs, those public properties, have a lot of people there at the same time. And so that can kind of be frustrating. So, it's an interesting landscape for blue-winged teal that time of year, for sure.
Yeah, you said you had some reports there, but like Toledo Bend Reservoir, you were hearing some guys saying that there were large numbers of birds showing up there.
Just prior to the season, I was hearing very good reports of places like Toledo Bend and the upper ends of those reservoirs. I have not personally heard how that opening morning hunt went, but it was at least positive to hear that some of these reservoirs were having, seeing birds prior to the season.
Yeah, after I talked to you last week, I'd reached out to a buddy of mine that I've stayed in contact with after teal hunting with him down there a few years ago, and I just kind of said, "Hey man, what's going on? Want to check in on you, see how what your expectations are." And he was like, "It is unbelievable." He sent me a couple videos of just swarm. Now he's down there in those rice ponds, just off the coast, and man, it was unbelievable. Just the video footage that he sent me, I was like, "Are those?" I mean, I couldn't even believe they were teal. It was just like clouds of blue wings. It was spectacular, and I think those guys hammered them until that storm rolled in, like you said.
Yeah, that's just it. I mean, leading up to the, again, those guys that are laying out that buffet on an annual basis, they really are taking out a lot of the, the ability to not have a good hunt. They're putting in the work, they're putting in the time and the money that has to go into that. And it's almost like clockwork for them. And until, Mother Nature shows up and throws them a curveball like we got this week.
What are going to be some of the impacts? And obviously, our thoughts and prayers are with everyone who's been impacted by the storm. But just from your perspective, looking at it, strictly as a waterfowl manager, is there any major concerns with so much water, or is this really not that big of a deal as far as habitat goes?
Well, yeah. So it's a kind of a catch-22 or double-edged sword type scenario. Those individuals that take the time, the money, and the energy that I was speaking about to put water in a very specific place and manage those water levels as a science or an art, suddenly getting a whole bunch of new water on the landscape, one, impacts that individual wetland that they've been managing. And two, it obviously, from a teal standpoint, changes their perspective of the landscape. So water on the landscape on opening weekend was there for a reason. Those individuals put that water there for a reason. There wasn't a lot of just, water out there that, sheet water that was from rain events leading up to the opener. Now there's going to be sheet water at a lot of places, including, the core of the teal hunting area going east. I think for the most part, the El Campo, Eagle Lake, that northern portion of the mid-coast didn't get near the rain that the coastal portion did, and now is moving into the Chenier Plain and into a large part of Louisiana. So a lot of these places, in the mid-coast, the core of the teal hunting area didn't get impacted directly and probably didn't get a ton of rain, which is, beneficial to not moving birds around. But that new water on the landscape is a real cue for ducks of all kinds to, start dispersing and going finding new food resources. And so, for the ducks point of view, it's can be very good, to have that new water on the landscape that is so very, very enticing to them to go explore and find new foods. So there's a real good chance that birds are going to get dispersed. Secondly, water does attract birds. So there's going to be places that get new birds. I'm still hearing good reports of abundant blue wings well into Canada. And so there's still plenty of birds north of us that, for whatever reason, ducks have this unbelievable sense of being able to detect new water on a landscape at even distances as far away as the prairie potholes. And so that can kind of trigger that migration. I was like, okay, it's time for us to go take advantage of this new landscape, this new water. And so it could actually attract birds to that area as well. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword for sure. As this thing's moving east, dumping, over a foot of rain, that definitely complicates things. You're starting to get higher water. Teal prefer real shallow water. And so, yeah, it's going to be a challenge for some, to say the least.
Yeah. And my co-host, Dr. Mike Brazier, he came down to my office earlier today, and we were kind of chatting about having this conversation, and he was just kind of throwing it out there, like, I wonder if those birds are going to go north to move out or east, or of how that wind impacts. I know there's probably no way to really know that. But it's interesting the way that you explained that just that new water alone is going to distribute those birds, let alone the wind impacts and things like that.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I mean, I think one of the more common ideas around that is birds kind of hunker down while the storm is occurring. And we actually have some data, telemetry work done on model ducks over the years where, they kind of sense it coming. They could kind of move to an area, before it hits, but as it's happening, they just kind of hunker down, and then very, very quickly start reacting to that new landscape, of whatever that might be. Either it be more productive, or it can be a landscape that is lost productivity because of the storm surge and things like that. So that's, I guess, one of the better, one of the things that we're seeing out of this storm. Storm surge is the one thing we hate to see, because that's a lot of salt water moving into freshwater environments and literally poisoning the landscape, killing things that you've been working on to grow for a long time along that coastal zone. And for the most part, it sounds like this is mostly a rain event, so it's dropping a lot of fresh water, and hopefully there's not a bunch of salt water intruding into freshwater environments right now.
Yeah, that would be very good news. And I don't know if you've talked to anybody down there who's shot a bunch of teal, but typically I always like to hear the reports where guys are like, oh, we're shooting all adult males. And that gives you the indication that those are kind of the first birds to migrate down. Have you heard anything like that? Because we've kind of chit-chatted about it around the office, where we were thinking that, man, with the low production in the prairies, this could be, if you start seeing a bunch of adult female birds showing up early, that'd be a pretty good indication that, with the low productivity, that's just kind of what it's showing. Have you talked to anybody about that yet?
Not specifically the bigger hunt clubs that, we're shooting, big numbers of birds. But yeah, that is without question the kind of the mantra about teal migration is, sending out, the adult males first and followed up by females in that year class of birds. Me personally, I went out and I did encounter two females, just randomly shooting at birds. So I did get two females, but what was important to note is all 6 of the birds I harvested on Saturday were all adults. There were no juveniles. Mind you, a tiny, tiny, tiny sample size, but yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we're expecting. One, you expect that early in the season, even on good years, that, the adults are kind of first, or at least adult males. But in 2, as you mentioned, in a year of below average productivity, even some of the adult females that were unsuccessful, that, weren't either didn't nest or were unsuccessful, they're going to depart with those adult males sometimes earlier. And we definitely started seeing birds arriving what seemed to be a couple weeks earlier than normal. And that's pretty good, or it's pretty intuitive thinking when you're thinking about the quality habitat that was in the prairies at the time and the quality habitat we had in parts of Texas. So it's not too surprising that birds departed a little bit earlier to take advantage of that. Their bodies need to be doing certain things. It's a life cycle event, and they need to be putting on, weight for migration, and they need to be getting protein for for molt and feather replacement. And so those life cycle events don't stop. And so they got to react to the landscape the best they can. And an early departure is one of those things they do to help do that. And so, yeah, I would expect. I mean, we won't have hard data on that information until we do the wing bee. But I believe everybody is thinking along those lines that it's going to be a heavy adult skewed harvest, even females, even early in the year. So
yeah. So it sounds like overall, it sounds like you're still pretty positive, even following the storm. You're still pretty positive that you guys are going to end up with a pretty strong teal season, early teal.
Yeah, I think. I mean, we definitely had some areas that got a lot of rain last night. Pushing a foot. Especially moving into the Chenier Plain in that area around Freeport. It sounded like they got around 10 inches. The one thing that, this land, that entire landscape has really been designed to shed water over the last literally 100 years. And so it's even shocking to me to be driving around the coastal prairie after a big rain and see a lot of water on the landscape, come back 24 hours later, and it's already, shed it. It's already, pushed off down the ditches and into the bayous and the creeks and, moving towards the Gulf. So it sheds water real quick. And, there's probably some people out there that, have impoundments or rice fields that have, water control structures in them that didn't have the ability, the means, the methods to pump. And, suddenly they have water now. And so that's one of those times that Mother Nature smiles upon you.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think overall our teal season isn't a bust. Sometimes these storms can be a real bust. I don't know the full extent what will happen in Louisiana, but it looks like they're going to get the full brunt of this storm in regard to significantly more rainfall than we did. And so that could be an attractant that could, draw birds their way. That could push birds out. But as a teal looks at that landscape, they're going to be grinning. It's like, wow, look at all this water I get to play on and spread out and not be, literally when you're in the Texas coast and opening day of teal season, if there's some water there, there's typically a duck blind there. And so they don't have to go where all the square boxes are anymore.
Yeah, no, that's a good thing for the teal. Sometimes not such a good thing for the hunter, but yeah, it sounds like there's enough hunters enjoying the opportunity right now. Before I get you out of here, I wanted to ask you how you guys were going into this teal season with excellent habitat across much of the state, which is hard to fathom just how large Texas is. And you're like, yeah, it seems to be pretty good everywhere. Like, wow, that's impressive. But what's it going to take for that habitat to maintain into the regular season? Or do you think most of these areas are going to go into the regular season when you guys open sometime in November, parts of the state? What's it going to take? And what do you think that habitat's going to look like, going into that regular season?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the reality is it will change. Some will change for the better. Some will change for the worse. As I mentioned earlier, there's fairly abundant water in the high plains right now, but the last week and a half has been some of our hottest temperatures of the entire summer, coupled with high wind days. And so we're literally losing water up here as fast as we possibly can. It's evaporating very, very quickly. And so that's one of those areas where things are kind of going downhill in that regard. There's going to be water here when ducks arrive, but there's going to be a lot less if something doesn't change soon. We're kind of in that weather pattern up here in the playas. As far as the coast, most of the water on the landscape is now purposeful. Shy of being in the marsh system or the bays, most of that water is very purposeful. So that's people putting that water out there and backing it up for the purposes of providing habitat for waterfowl. And so, those areas are still going to have water and still be looking very good when duck season begins. And then as far as East Texas, the key there is it's typically a later season hunt than the Gulf Coast, and that's actually why we open that season later. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but our north zone opens later than our south zone. But we're dealing with different ducks that use a habitat a lot differently. and obviously significantly different habitats. And so the birds that are in Northeast Texas typically are later migrators. Our harvest data shows that hunting is better later than early in the season, as opposed to the Gulf Coast, where some of our best hunts are that early November period. And so we always want to take advantage of those early November days as much as we can, and then vice versa with the North Zone. We want to be able to take as much advantage of weekends in December and January. And so luckily we have a long season, and we're able to do that in all of our zones. But East Texas, it's driven by rainfall. When those rivers start flooding and begin to get overbank flood events, that's a real attractant to birds on a continental scale. And we're learning very rapidly through some modern telemetry stuff of the numerous different species of ducks and geese, that this idea of north-south is in our head, is not only north-south, but there's just as much east-west movement going on. And, a rain event in East Texas can draw ducks from literally all over both Central and Mississippi flyways. And so timely rain events, flooding events in that landscape draws birds that landscape. Now, if it lingers on too long and the water stays on the landscape too long, you begin to see a decline in ducks. Similarly to that same scenario of, they just have so many options, you don't see large concentrations of birds. So the perfect thing is a nice little pulse of a flood. Water gets out into the back waters of the bottomlands, and then the rivers go back down. That water's been captured and now out there on the landscape. So yeah, I think, to be honest with you, the state moving into the regular duck season is overall in pretty good shape. Considerably better than where we were this time last year, habitat-wise, for sure.
That's definitely good news for Texas hunters and anybody traveling to hunt there. Kevin, this has been great. I think everyone probably picked up, some great information, especially, those coastal areas and the way that, ducks react to like a hurricane like this. I think it's interesting. I think it's not only important for Texas hunters to know that, but just for all of our listeners to understand these ducks are moving. They're going to take advantage of any habitat that's provided, whether it's man-made, like you mentioned, or natural. So yeah, man, I really appreciate you coming on here today, and we'll have to get you back on when the regular duck season starts, and we can talk regular duck season. We'll be able to follow up with all that habitat update.
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoy visiting with you guys and getting a chance to communicate with a broad audience. And I would love to jump back on with you here in a couple months.
Awesome, Kevin. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
I'd like to thank my guest, Kevin Cry, Texas Waterfowl Program Leader, for coming on today and really explaining what the habitat and the hunting conditions are like in Texas right now. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for getting the show together and putting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU Podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.